The desert does not welcome you. It tolerates you. Briefly. The way a stone tolerates rain, absorbing what it must, indifferent to the rest. In the fall of 2004, the Anbar province of western Iraq was one of the most hostile operational environments on Earth, and not simply because of the insurgency. It was hostile the way old places are hostile, not through malice but through sheer geological indifference. The land was flat and ancient and dry in a way that preceded every human civilization that had ever attempted to settle it. Empires had crossed that desert. Armies from Babylon, from Persia, from the Mongol Khanate, from the Ottoman Empire, from Britain. All of them left. The desert remained. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment arrived in that desert in the spring of 2004 carrying 60 pounds of body armor, M4 carbines, and the institutional confidence of the most technologically advanced military force in human history. By October, that confidence had been worn down to something quieter, more careful. The kind of alertness that comes not from training but from months of sustained exposure to an environment that is actively trying to kill you, not through any coordinated intelligence but simply through heat, distance, dehydration, and the grinding psychological weight of never being entirely sure what is watching you from the dark. 40 kilometers southwest of Ramadi, in a stretch of featureless terrain that military planners had designated Sector Delta 7, a long-range reconnaissance element established a series of observation posts along a suspected insurgent resupply corridor in early October of that year. Their mission was straightforward. Their experience was not. The Bedouin tribes of that region had a name for that particular stretch of desert. Translated from the Arabic, it means roughly, the place where the ground listens. They had been avoiding it for generations. Not because of the war, not because of the insurgents, not because of the Americans. Because of something older. Something they said had been present in that desert long before Islam arrived in the 7th century, long before the great Arab conquests reshaped the ancient world. Something that moved at night, they said. Something drawn to the sound of human voices and the particular heat signature of human bodies in cold desert air. Official records classify the events of October 14 through October 17, 2004, in Sector Delta 7 as routine reconnaissance operations. No hostile contact. No casualties. No significant activities reported. The after-action documentation is sparse, procedural, and entirely unremarkable. The men who were there call it something else entirely. If you value careful, documented investigation of events that exist at the edge of the official record, recovered from personal testimonies, declassified archives, and the spaces between redacted lines, stay with me. To understand what these men encountered, you need to understand what kind of war they were fighting, what kind of terrain they were operating in, and what kind of psychological and physiological state they were in by the time the events of mid-October began to unfold. The year 2004 represented a fundamental pivot point in the Iraq War. The initial invasion and the fall of Baghdad in April 2003 had given way to something far more complex and far more dangerous. A decentralized Sunni insurgency that had taken root most deeply in Anbar province, the vast desert region that occupies the entire western third of the country. Anbar shares borders with Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. It is larger than the state of Louisiana. In 2004, it was estimated that coalition forces controlled, in any meaningful sense, perhaps 30% of its territory. The rest was a mosaic of contested towns, open desert, and road networks seeded with improvised explosive devices. The 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, a unit with lineage tracing to the airborne operations of the Second World War and distinguished combat service in Vietnam, had been deployed to Anbar as part of the coalition's effort to interdict insurgent supply lines running between Syria and the Euphrates River Valley. These supply lines were not merely logistical. They carried foreign fighters, weapons, financing, and communications equipment that was sustaining the insurgency's operational capacity at a critical time. The reconnaissance element assigned to Sector Delta 7 was a 6-man team operating in a rotational pattern across 4 observation posts. Their job was to watch the desert, to count vehicles, to report foot traffic, to sit in the dark with their night vision goggles and their thermal surveillance equipment and their radios and their MREs, and to observe. 4 days at a time, without significant movement, without hot food, without adequate sleep. Sleep deprivation at the level these soldiers were experiencing, consistently under 4 hours per night for a period of weeks, produces measurable and well-documented effects on human cognition and perception. The research literature is unambiguous on this point. Sustained sleep restriction degrades threat discrimination, increases false positive identification of stimuli, and creates conditions under which the boundary between genuine sensory input and cognitive fabrication becomes genuinely difficult to locate. This is not a weakness. It is biology. The forward operating base from which the element was staging was a converted agricultural compound on the western edge of a dry wadi, a seasonal riverbed that had not carried water in years. The compound's walls were mud brick, 2 feet thick, bleached the color of old bone. Inside the perimeter, 2 hardened shelters reinforced with sandbags and corrugated steel, a generator that ran on diesel and vibrated the ground with a low, continuous hum, and a central courtyard where soldiers slept in shifts on cots that had been carried in by vehicle and that already smelled of the men who had used them before. The smell of that compound, as described by multiple soldiers who served there, was specific. Diesel fuel and dust and the particular chemical sharpness of insect repellent applied in quantity. Underneath those surface scents, something older, the mineralized exhalation of soil that had been dry for decades, releasing its last stored memory of water. The unit's assigned interpreter, a man from Ramadi who worked under the call sign Tariq, and whose real identity has not been disclosed in any available record, refused to sleep inside the compound from the first night. He told the element's intelligence sergeant, in a conversation that was recorded in the sergeant's personal journal, that the ground itself was compromised. When pressed, he said the following as best as the sergeant could transcribe from memory: "There are presences in this part of the desert that have been here since before any religion you or I know. They are not evil in the way you understand evil. They are simply old, and they do not like the noise your machines make." The intelligence sergeant noted this exchange. He did not include it in his official reporting. The first anomalous event occurred in the early hours of October 15th, at Observation Post 2, a shallow scrape in the desert floor roughly 3 kilometers northeast of the FOB, reinforced with a low berm of loose stone and camouflaged with netting. 2 soldiers were on watch: Specialist David Reyes, 23 years old, from El Paso, Texas, and Private First Class Marco Castillo, 21, from San Antonio. The first hour was nothing. Me and Castillo were doing rotating scans. One of us on the NVGs, one resting eyes. The stars were out. No moon. The desert looks different through night vision when there's no moon. It's this flat green void, and everything that reflects any heat at all just shimmers slightly at the edges. We've been out there 3 nights at that point. You get used to a certain baseline of sound. There's always something. Wind if there's any. Beetles in the sand. Some kind of small animal moving out past the wire sometimes. It's not silence. It's texture. Around 0300, Castillo tapped my arm. Not urgently, just a tap. Like, pay attention. I came up on the NVGs and he just pointed out toward the northwest. I scanned that sector for maybe 30 seconds and saw nothing. No movement. But then I noticed what he was actually pointing at, which wasn't a visual thing. It was the absence of sound. Complete absence. Not wind down. Not gradual. Just off. Like someone had cut a cable. No insects. No ambient movement. Nothing. And I want to be clear about this because I know how it sounds. That level of silence in that environment at that time of night is not normal. It is not a thing that happens naturally out there. At the same time, I became aware of a pressure sensation in my ears. Like the kind you get in an aircraft during descent, but sustained. Not painful. Just present. Castillo was pressing his fingers to his temple, which told me he was feeling it too. And then his NVG started artifacting. This green flicker at the right-hand edge of the image. He tapped the unit, thinking it was a battery issue. We had changed the batteries 40 minutes earlier. They were fresh. Alpha 2 Actual, this is OP2. We have an anomaly at our position. Requesting SITREP guidance. Over. OP2, send it. We have gone to 0 ambient sound. Complete cessation. Both personnel reporting ear pressure, no known cause. Castillo's NVGs are artifacting on fresh batteries. There is also, I'm not sure how to put this in proper terms, actual. There is a subaudible tone. More felt than heard. It's been present for approximately 90 seconds. OV. OP2, are you taking fire? Any visual on personnel or Vehi? Please. Negative. Desert is clean. No movement. I've scanned full 360. Nothing out there. Over. Copy OP2. Maintain position. Log time and duration. If you get visual on anything at all, you call it immediately. What's your weapon? Status. Weapons are up. We're good. It's just the quiet actual. The quiet is WR. Over. Understood OP2. Keep on. It's open. Out. The tone lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds by my watch. Then it stopped, and the insects came back, not gradually, all at once, like a switch. 1 second nothing, next second the full nighttime desert again. Castillo exhaled. I realized I had been holding my breath. At first light, before we packed down the OP, I did a sweep of the ground around our position. The sand out there holds impressions well in the cool of the morning before the heat distorts everything. Maybe 60 meters to our northeast, I found a series of depressions, evenly spaced, roughly 18 inches between each impression. They came from the open desert to the northwest, tracking on a straight bearing toward our position. They approached to within 40 meters of where Castillo and I had been sitting, and then they stopped, not turned. Not overlapped going back the other direction. Stopped. In the middle of flat, open, featureless ground. I stood there looking at that endpoint for a long time. I took photographs with a disposable camera I had bought at a PX in Kuwait. I didn't report the tracks through official channels. I didn't know what I would say. The photographs Reyes describes were later included in an informal collection of documentation circulated among members of the unit. They have not appeared in any official record. What Reyes and Castillo experienced at OP2 that night would not remain an isolated event. 3 days into the element's rotation in Sector Delta 7, a second incident was logged, this time at Observation Post 4, 11 kilometers south of Reyes's position, along the dry southern corridor that ran parallel to a disused pipeline track. The team at OP4 was led by Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a 10-year Army veteran who had completed a previous deployment to Kosovo and who was, by all available assessments, a steady and methodical soul. We had the LRS-3 set up facing northwest, covering the open approach. Long-range advanced scout surveillance system. It's a thermal and day optical device on a tripod, stabilized with a laser rangefinder. Very capable piece of equipment. We'd been running it for 4 nights without any issue. No false positives, no malfunctions. On the night of the 15th, at approximately 0115, the display began showing what I can only describe as a thermal bloom. A large, diffuse heat signature at a range of approximately 820 meters, according to the laser. It was not a vehicle. Vehicles have a different heat profile, more structured, with hot spots at the engine block and exhaust. It was not a human. Human thermal signatures at that range appear as small, defined shapes. This was large, irregular, and it was shifting continuously, not like wind-driven movement, but like something that was changing shape intentionally. I called it in immediately. Josie told us to continue monitoring and document. The bloom persisted for 9 minutes, 14 seconds. I timed it because I was watching the clock. Then it contracted. Not gradually. It pulled inward rapidly, the way a flame goes out when you blow on it, and disappeared. When I slewed the camera back to that grid position approximately 20 minutes later, the sand at that location was radiating residual heat, measurably warmer than the surrounding ground, as if something had been sitting on it, or in it, for a long time. I've been doing this job for 10 years. I have a rational explanation for almost everything I have ever seen in the field. I do not have a rational explanation for what the LRS-3 showed me that night. I have a list of things it was not. That's not the same King. Webb's account was substantiated in its essential details by both other soldiers present at OP4 that night. The LRS-3 unit was inspected and tested the following morning and found to be operating within normal parameters. No malfunction was identified. No atmospheric inversion or temperature event was logged by weather assets operating in the sector that night that would account for the anomalous signature. A third account came from an entirely separate source. A Marine Corps Civil Affairs team operating in a small agricultural village approximately 22 kilometers northeast of the reconnaissance elements area of operations. The Civil Affairs team was engaged in standard counterinsurgency-era engagement work, conducting a census, registering households, assessing water and electrical infrastructure. Their interpreter, a man from Haditha with a university-level education in Arabic literature, requested a private conversation with the team's officer in charge after a series of home visits. He told the officer that the village elders had been discussing the Americans in the desert to the southwest with something the interpreter described as genuine concern. Not hostility, not indifference, but concern, the kind extended towards someone who has unknowingly walked into a dangerous situation. The elders believed the Americans had positioned themselves near what local tradition identified as a boundary, a threshold. The Arabic term used was al-Qat al-Ul, the first line, a conceptual and geographical boundary described in the oral traditions of the tribal confederacies of western Iraq as the outer edge of a domain that predates human habitation of the valley. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense of the word. The oral traditions of the tribes of Anbar province contain a sophisticated and internally consistent framework for understanding the desert as an inhabited space, inhabited not merely by humans and animals, but by presences that exist in a category that predates Islamic theology, and that Islamic theology, when it arrived in the 7th century, partially absorbed into the concept of the jinn. The jinn of Arab religious and folk tradition are frequently misrepresented in Western popular culture as a single category of wish-granting spirit. The actual taxonomy is considerably more nuanced. Among the classifications documented by ethnographers working in pre-Islamic Arabian religious tradition are entities specifically associated with the deep desert, beings described as drawn to heat, sound, and the electromagnetic disturbance of artificial light. Entities that are not predatory in the conventional sense but that respond to intrusion with a kind of territorial attention that humans, when they notice it, uniformly describe as deeply wrong. Dr. Farouk al-Rashid, a Jordanian ethnographer whose 2001 survey of Western Iraqi oral traditions was published through the University of Amman Press, documented the specific concept of certain desert zones as what he termed responsive ground, terrain that exhibits behaviors perceptible to human observers in response to human presence, in ways that tribal oral literature has described consistently across multiple generations and multiple tribal lineages with no recorded cross-contamination. His work was academic. It was published before the invasion of Iraq. It had nothing to do with American soldiers or their equipment failures. The coincidence between those documented traditions and what American reconnaissance soldiers were reporting in Sector Delta 7 in October 2004 is, depending on your framework for interpreting reality, either meaningless or significant. On the night of October 16th, the thermal surveillance systems at observation posts 2, 3, and 4 failed simultaneously. The window of failure was 4 minutes and 7 seconds, after which all 3 systems came back online without intervention. The maintenance log filed the following morning attributed the failure to a power surge propagating through the shared generator system at the FOB. The unit's electrician, a 26-year-old staff sergeant from Georgia who had worked on military power systems for 6 years, tested the generator, the distribution cables, and all connected equipment for 2 hours. He could not replicate the surge. He could not identify its cause. His notes conclude with the phrase, "No fault found. Cannot explain." During the same window of equipment failure, soldiers at 2 of the 3 affected posts described identical visual artifacts through their personal NVGs. A persistent green flicker at the rightmost edge of the image field that, when looked at directly, resolved into static. When looked at peripherally, in the unfocused way that experienced soldiers learn to use night vision, it consistently appeared to take the shape of a tall, standing figure. At the edge of the light. At the edge of the wire. Not moving. Watching. October 17, 2004. The last operational night of the reconnaissance elements rotation in Sector Delta 7. A relieving unit was scheduled to arrive at the FOB the following morning. By midnight, most of the elements' equipment had been staged for transfer. The observation posts were in the process of being stood down in sequence. At 2,240 hours, A four-man patrol designated Kilo 6 departed the FOB on foot for a final route clearance sweep of the southern approach corridor, standard procedure before a handoff, intended to ensure the incoming element had current intelligence on ground conditions. The patrol was led by Sergeant First Class Aaron Tillman, a 16-year Army veteran with 2 previous combat deployments, a reputation within the unit for exceptional situational awareness, and a personal leadership philosophy that one subordinate later described as, "He doesn't rattle." The other 3 members of Kilo 6 were Sergeant Daniel Park, Specialist James Okafor, and Private First Class Luis Mendez. All 4 were experienced. All 4 had been operating in Sector Delta 7 for the full rotation. All 4 were aware of the anomalous events of the preceding nights, though the extent to which those events had been formally communicated across the element is unclear from available documentation. Kilo 6 checked in by radio at their first waypoint, approximately 3 kilometers south-southwest of the FOB, at 2,255 hours. The radio log records the transmission as, Alpha 2, this is Kilo 6. At waypoint Alpha. Sector clear. Continuing movement. Routine. Professional. Nothing in the transmission suggested anything unusual. Their next scheduled check-in was at 2,340 hours. At 2340 there was silence. The radio operator at the FOB attempted contact. No response. At 2355, a second attempt. Nothing. At 0010, a third attempt. This time with the patrol's emergency frequency as a backup channel. Nothing. At 0025 hours, the commanding officer initiated a contingency search protocol. A quick reaction force of 6 soldiers was staged at the FOB gate. The interpreter Tariq was asked to accompany the QRF as a precaution. He refused. He reportedly said, "Not that direction. Not tonight." He was not pressed further. The QRF reached Kilo 6's first waypoint at 0048 hours. What they found there has been described consistently across the accounts of all 6 QRF members, in personal statements collected informally by the unit's intelligence sergeant in the days following the incident. Kilo 6's equipment was present. Both assault packs, the patrol's primary radio handset, laid flat in the sand, and the element's 240 Bravo machine gun, a weapon that weighs 27 pounds unloaded and that no trained soldier abandons without cause, set down carefully in the desert, bipod deployed, feed tray closed. As if placed there deliberately. Not dropped. Not discarded in flight. Set down with care. There were no signs of struggle. No blood. No spent brass. No evidence of any contact, hostile or otherwise. The ground around the equipment showed 4 sets of boot prints leading southwest. They did not return. The QRF followed the tracks. 900 meters southwest of the equipment cache, in a shallow desert depression that did not appear on any of the unit's grid maps and that the QRF leader later described as looking like it had been scooped out of the earth by something very large and very patient, they found Kilo 6. All 4 men were seated in the sand, facing southwest, rifles across their knees in a rough line. They were uninjured. They were not in distress, at least not in any way that was immediately visible. They were simply sitting, in silence, in the dark, facing the open desert. When the QRF's team leader reached Sergeant First Class Tillman and put a hand on his shoulder, Tillman looked up with an expression that multiple witnesses described as composed. Not dazed, not frightened, composed, and said, "How long have we been out here?" He believed it had been approximately 15 minutes since their last radio check at waypoint Alpha. The actual elapsed time from the 2255 radio transmission to the moment of recovery was 1 hour and 53 minutes. The after-action debrief of Kilo 6 was conducted at the FOB beginning at approximately 0400 hours on the morning of October 18th, before the relieving unit arrived. The debrief was led by the commanding officer and the intelligence sergeant. It was recorded. The original recording has not surfaced in any available archive. What exists is a written summary, 11 pages in its classified form, submitted through the chain of command and later requested through a Freedom of Information Act filing in 2011. The response to that FOIA request returned a version of the document from which pages 3 through 9 had been redacted entirely, solid black rectangles where the content had been. The surviving material is administrative. Patrol timeline, grid coordinates, equipment accountability, personnel status assessments. One line in the section labeled Personnel Observations survived the redaction process. It's all 4 personnel describe moving toward an unidentified light source at an unknown bearing. No further description provided. No disciplinary action recommended. Personnel assessed as mission capable. An unidentified light source at an unknown bearing. In the middle of a flat, dark desert at 0100 hours for experienced soldiers, led by a 16-year veteran described by his peers as unrattleable, abandoned their equipment and walked 900 meters into open terrain following something that they later could not describe, and for which they could not account nearly 2 hours of elapsed time. Sergeant First Class Aaron Tillman left the Army in 2007 following the conclusion of his enlistment. He gave one published interview about his service in Iraq, appearing in a veterans magazine in the spring of 2009. The interview covered his experiences in Ramadi. It did not mention October 17, 2004, or Sector Delta 7, or the events of that final night. The interviewer did not ask. Whether that was by arrangement or by coincidence is unknown. The 3 other members of Kilo 6 have not spoken publicly about the incident in any format that has been identified by this investigation. The operational records of the reconnaissance element from Sector Delta 7, patrol logs, radio transcripts, thermal surveillance reports, observation post daily journals, were transferred to a regional archival facility in 2006 as part of a standard operational records consolidation. A records request submitted to that facility in 2013 received an acknowledgement letter followed by a secondary notification stating that the requested files could not be located in the archive inventory. The phrasing of that notification, unavailable for retrieval at this time. A follow-up request submitted in 2016 received the same response. A third request, submitted in 2019, received no response at all. Combat fatigue is real. Perceptual distortion under sustained operational stress is real. Equipment failures have mundane mechanical causes. Tracks in desert sand can be made by animals that approach and then double back in their own prints. Thermal artifacts on surveillance systems occur under specific atmospheric conditions. Disorientation in featureless terrain is a documented and well-understood navigational hazard. All of these explanations exist. All of them are available. None of them require anything unusual to be true. And yet, none of them fully accounts for 4 professional soldiers sitting in a depression that wasn't on any map, facing the same direction in silence, with an hour and 53 minutes gone from their memory. None of them explains why the unit's interpreter, who had been told nothing specific about the patrol's route, refused to enter the desert that night. And none of them explains why the elders of a village 22 kilometers away had already been expressing concern, before the patrol was lost, before the QRF went out, about what the Americans might encounter in that direction. There is a particular kind of honesty that war forces on people, and it is not the honesty of certainty. It is the honesty of the limit. Of standing at the edge of what your training and your instruments and your institutional framework can explain, and acknowledging that the edge exists, that there is something beyond it, that you cannot say with confidence what that something is. The men who served in Sector Delta 7 in October 2004 were not recruits. They were not men prone to hysteria or fabrication. They had every professional reason to stay silent about what they experienced, and by and large they did. The accounts that exist do so despite that incentive toward silence, not because of any incentive toward disclosure. That matters when you are trying to assess the weight of the testimony. What happened in that desert? The honest answer is that we do not know. We have a coherent pattern of anomalous events reported independently by multiple unconnected witnesses across a 72-hour window. We have a redacted document with one surviving line that raises more questions than it resolves. We have an interpreter's refusal, a village's concern, and a folklore tradition documented entirely independently of any military context that describes encounters in that precise region in terms that map uncomfortably well onto what American soldiers reported in 2004. We have a desert that is not a backdrop, that is not simply terrain, that is a place with a history so long that human warfare, for all its violence and consequence, is merely a recent and temporary feature of it. The Babylonians crossed that desert. The Persians, the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the British, the Americans, all of them brought their weapons and their maps and their institutional confidence. All of them left. The Bedouin have a saying, recorded in the ethnographic literature of the region, not invented for this telling, that translates roughly as, "The desert remembers everyone who crosses it." Not all of them remember the desert. Sergeant First Class Tillman and his men came back. They were assessed as mission capable. They went home. They raised families or they didn't. They slept or they didn't. They talked about it or they kept it inside, in the way soldiers keep things inside, in the locked room behind the eyes that never quite empties and never quite fills. But in the shape of their silence, in the absence of the interview, in the unreturned records request, in the interpreter who wouldn't board the vehicle, in the elders who already knew, there is something that resists the tidy closure of a rational explanation. Something that suggests those four men, sitting in that unmarked depression in the desert at 0100 hours, facing southwest toward whatever light they had followed, had reached an edge. And that what was on the other side of it was older than the war. War creates many ghosts, but not all of them are human. If this kind of careful, sourced, and measured investigation resonates with you, subscribe. No algorithms. No filler. New episodes are published when the research is complete and not before.